And now it's my great pleasure to welcome Al Rapaport from Open Mind Zen. We're going to talk about important keys to conscious inner and outer dialogue.
All right. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Beth Ann and Larry for staying in touch with me over the years. And it's wonderful to see that you all have such a advanced AV system now. It's making me jealous, a little bit jealous. We don't have one this sophisticated, but it's great to see everyone participating however they can, whether it's online or in person. So today, what I'd like to speak about is dialogue. And normally when we think of dialogue in an outer sense. I'm communicating with other people. But any of us who've spent even 2 or 3 minutes in either meditation or reflection at one point or another realize that we have an inner dialogue, which sometimes parallels our outer dialogue, but it doesn't always. And so what I'd like to talk to you about today is how we work with our inner dialogue, so that, and then move that into a positive way of dialoguing in an outer sense with others also. So I think most of you know I'm the director of Open Mind Zen. We are now a network of about 8 or 9 meditation groups throughout the United States and Europe. And I also developed a method called Zen Dialogue, which is a form of dialoguing with a facilitator that helps participants to get in touch with different aspects of themselves that they're not aware of, or they're aware of and they're obstructive, both. And so the principle behind that, and the reason I'm mentioning this is it's germane to this topic, the principle behind it is that we have different aspects of the self that we're not conscious of. So these aspects are functioning either in an unconscious or a subconscious way. So unconscious means we're totally unaware of what's going on within us. We just react to a hot button issue or to some kind of thing that's disturbing. And we don't know why am I reacting that way? I can't tell you how many times over the years people have come to me saying, well, I don't understand why I do X, Y, or Z. Why do I do it? And so that would be considered an unconscious aspect of the self. Now, subconscious aspect is something that we can be somewhat aware of, but it's still functioning underneath the conscious awareness to a large degree. Now I realize I can walk around with this a little, so it's a little more comfortable. First of all, what I'd like to get us to in terms of this topic is how we get in touch with our inner dialogue. So the only way that I know of to get in touch with the inner dialogue is to stop and sit down and quiet things a little bit. Because as a former speaker mentioned earlier about the bullying, there's a lot of that going on. It's not just bullying, but it's aggression in all different forms of speech. It's become the norm, unfortunately, in many aspects of the political life in our culture and other cultures around the world. But you also see it in interpersonal connection too. And I think part of it is we're not taught how to dialogue. It's assumed that we know how to dialogue, and the fact is that we often don't. So the first step, I believe, is getting in touch with our own inner dialogue, with our reactivity. And we do that in the mindfulness tradition, because I also am a mindfulness teacher, by employing what's called non-judgmental awareness. So non-judgmental awareness is something that we use to quiet ourselves to the point where we can experience what's happening without prejudging it. So many times when we're engaged in dialogue with somebody or a relationship with somebody, we may feel that we're not being heard. You hear that expression a lot. And not being heard means perhaps, very likely, that the other person is not applying that kind of awareness to the communication that's going on. They're supposing they know what you're going to say and what it's about and who you are. So step number one is get in touch with our own inner dialogue through quieting ourselves, at least to some extent, and doing some kind of self-reflection or meditation, hopefully on a regular basis, because to be honest, it's not easy. It's not easy to tune out the outside noise these days. Most of us are highly connected to social media. We have friends, we watch TV. All of those influences kind of bombard us with tremendous amounts of information. And I don't think that biologically we're actually psychologically built, so to speak. I think we still have Paleolithic bodies and minds. And, there was very basic information then. It was get food, relate to this person, sew something, make a garment, hunt an animal. That's quite basic. And those skills were developed by people in those eras. But now we're just bombarded with tremendous amounts of information, way more than we're able to process or deal with. I remember back when, for instance, when you wanted to travel somewhere, say to Europe, as a former speaker mentioned, you would go to a travel agent. There are actually people whose job it was to book your travel for you. And it would take about 20 minutes usually. You'd walk in, you'd book it, and then you'd walk out with an actual physical ticket. Now, when I book a flight to Europe, because I do some teaching in Europe, I spend hours, trying to get the right one and figure out where my transfers are. Is it going to land at the right time? Do I have the days right? And sometimes it's the next day. And there's so many options that it takes a tremendous amount more time. It's not actually more convenient. It's actually less in many ways. So, but that's the way it is now. There are very few travel agents around. But the point is that the information load has gotten immense. And when the information load is immense, we have to counter that somehow in our lives in order to get in touch with what is our true self. Our true self, I'm defining as that individual, that presence that exists when all the other outside influences are tuned out for some period of time. Some period of time. Obviously, we can't do it all the time. All of us work. We all have relationships. We all have things we have to get done that requires communication. But at least for some period of time, if we can tune that out and start to get in touch with who we actually are, then we can begin to be aware of our inner communication, our inner dialogue with ourself. So our inner dialogue with ourself can consist of a lot of different elements. One of the things I'll speak about just for a minute is what we call the inner critic in the Zen dialogue method, which maybe some of you are familiar with. So the inner critic is a part of ourself that has a function. There's a need for inner criticism at times, but often the inner critic becomes way too powerful, way out of touch with what we really need in our life. And then it becomes a destructive force. So being aware of voices or parts of ourselves, like the inner critic, is extremely important in order to settle ourselves to the point where we can then communicate in a really valuable way and a really constructive way with others, regardless of the influences in our culture to the contrary. It begins with us. We have to begin with ourselves and our own relationships, because that is what we can exert some control over. We can't always exert control over everything else that's going on around us. We do our best. Maybe we vote or we engage in some kind of protest or some kind of organization, whatever. We do our best, but the fact is we can't control the larger body politic or what's happening on the earth to a substantial degree. What we can control is how we speak, how we relate to others. So once we kind of get in touch with our inner dialogue, and we've managed to get in touch with who we really are, which I think probably a lot of you have over the years through all the practices and the things you've been involved with, then we can start looking at, well, how am I actually communicating? And this is quite important because communication happens in many ways, of course. It doesn't happen just through our words. It happens perhaps through our attitude, our body, uh, disposition, a lot of different things. But in terms of our dialogue, how often are we really listening? And what I'm speaking about in terms of harmonizing the inner and outer begins in the same way in an outer sense as it does as an inner sense, which is that we first have to stop when we have to allow information to reach us without prejudging it. So what I mean by this in an individual's perspective or an individual situation or relationship situation is probably the better way to put it, is when we're speaking with someone, when we're relating to someone, we're allowing ourselves to regard what they're saying non-judgmentally. So we're applying that non-judgmental awareness I was speaking about and hear it. Now, that doesn't mean we have to agree with them, but disagreeing before we listen is a real problem. I think I see that all the time. You see people on TV debating different positions, and often they'll be interrupting each other and talking over each other. Sometimes you get people that will refuse to quit talking sometimes. And that to me is the opposite of this. It just evidences someone who thinks they know everything and is not hearing you. So it's one thing to debate someone or to not agree with them, that's fine. But you can't really do that properly until you've heard them. So when we're dealing with someone that we're very close to, we think we know who they are and we think we know what they're going to say a lot of the time. And this is also a problem. So we have this concept in Zen called not knowing. And not knowing is kind of like what I was speaking about, this form of non-judgment, residing in awareness and residing in hearing, and then allowing that information to come to us. And then when we communicate back to them, we can speak to them about how what they've said makes us feel, rather than attacking them as a person. If we're engaged in some kind of heated discussion, we can take the heat down dramatically by not escalating, not meeting anger with more anger, but rather letting it sink in and allowing ourselves to respond with how we feel rather than attacking either the subject or the person. And when we do that, provided the other person is willing to engage in this kind of a process, then we can truly communicate because we're hearing each other. We're hearing each other. So this Zen dialogue system that I work with, I call psycho-spiritual balancing. And what I mean by that is that we're taking the psychology and spirituality, and I'm not sure where one begins and the other ends, to be honest. I think they're very tied together. What we're doing is we're getting in touch with the different aspects of ourself that prevent us from living fully and also from communicating compassionately. And compassionate communication is something that I think if we can, as individuals, practice, then perhaps it'll make at least some kind of a difference. If we get enough people doing that, then it can really make a difference in how the general communication, politically and everything else, occurs. I think that people are craving this. The vast majority of people are craving some kind of a return to communicating with respect and communicating in a way where we're not just creating agitation, creating more division, creating more suffering for people. And that begins with our own personal divisions and suffering within ourselves. This is a very important part of Zen, I believe, and also just of being a human, is that we have to start with ourself and then allow that understanding to move out to the greater arena of communicating with others. In a way, when I look at the world and what's happening with countries in the world and all the conflict and the squabbles going on, it's really in a macro way of what's going on often within ourselves. We have all these different voices, all these different aspects are not often in harmony. So bringing this ourself into harmony being aware of what's going on internally, I think is indispensable in terms of helping us influence the greater aspect of what's going on to the best that we can. And then understanding that there's only so much we can do. And there are times when we have to let go, because otherwise we just are in a state of constant suffering. So do what we can do, but let go when we can't. And I believe that that is a great prescription for living in a way where we're acting in a way that's appropriate in a given situation, but also not suffering about things that there's nothing we can do about, which can really squelch the joy and the love and the spontaneity that we feel in our lives.